actually bite the bullet and develop a Terraform module for some piece of our infrastructure. And there was a good discussion around this in the thread here. I agree with a lot of the points that were brought up. Some ones I wanted to highlight. Uh, Start here, like, Zach brings up, if you have lots of resources that compose some, creating some capability or solving some use case, that's one of the good criteria for when you create a module. I think that alone is not enough. I think you have to look at the second point there, which is, are you going to be using this multiple times throughout your organization? Is it reusable, basically? And what kind of best practices do you want to establish? So standardization. And one thing you'll notice with like the Cloud Posse ecosystem is standardization is a huge factor for us. We use the Terraform null label to ensure all of our modules have the same interface. Other considerations, like what Andre brought up here, is like, yeah, if it takes you just 10 minutes to implement it using raw Terraform resources, maybe it's not complicated enough to merit creating a Terraform module for that. And in our module ecosystem, there are some of these modules, they took a tremendous investment to get right. Like this Datadog Terraform module, this has cost our customers well over $100,000 to develop this one Terraform module. So when you start putting the pieces together, it gets very expensive to develop well-built Terraform modules. And for an organization to make that investment, they're going to have to be upfront about it, that it is an investment. It's going to take time to develop. To implement the tests for it is important.
I think part of it is one of the things that's kind of a pet peeve of tutorials and stuff of hey, let's use Terraform to let's spend 10 minutes using Terraform to spin up an EC2 instance or whatever, and it's like, that's great,
nailed it,
but it's like you didn't even get through the surface tension on the water. Like,
yeah,
there is so much deeper to go on, and composability of things becomes really important when you do anything remotely non-trivial.
yeah. I like to think of exactly, and I like to think of Terraform modules as building blocks. And I think it's important to think about what your building blocks are before you just start creating random blocks that just aren't gonna mash together very well. I think a good place to start at is looking at the Cloud Posse ecosystem and how we think about modules to get some inspiration about how your company might want to create modules. There's also an important distinction here. We've been thinking about it a little bit more lately as we've been working on our documentation for Cloud Posse, which is starting to slowly drip out on our documentation portal. But there's a difference between kind of when we talk about modules, we're often talking about what are often child modules, modules that are designed to be called by root modules. And root modules in Terraform are your top level modules. These are the modules that have Terraform state. And when you think about your root modules, that's another consideration of what you want your building blocks to be there. So we have published some of our root modules under Terraform AWS components, which is what we call them. And this is how we think about it, breaking it down into these building blocks. It's interesting because when I look at a lot of organizations, design patterns for creating modules, they're very different often than how I think about it at Cloud Posse. You'll see a company, they'll have their applications module, and that module creates a VPC and creates an EKS cluster and deploys their application, maybe even creates the ECR repo. And that's very different from how I think about those things. I think that the VPC exists regardless of if you have an application or not. Therefore, it has its own module, its own root module. I think of Kubernetes or EKS as a platform, and therefore that has its own life cycle, and that exists regardless of if you have apps deployed to it. So that's its own layer, that's its own root module. And then you finally get down to creating modules for your applications themselves because they have their own life cycle as well. And coupling those life cycles all together is a risk. It's also an advantage. It makes your cold starts really nice when you have fewer modules, just one module that does everything. Your cold starts are easy, but your blast radius is massive. So I would think about when you're deciding like where your modules belong is how much you stick in them and where you want your kind of blast radius to be, your partitions there.
I think one important thing to add on to that is that if you have your application, root module or whether it's a module or a root module, child module, or whatever, if that module, if you need to go multi-region, having your application deploy the VPC alongside of what your EKS cluster can quickly you can quickly run into the issues of like you haven't sectioned it up enough that when you want to break it out, it becomes a problem. And I think that thinking about that up front, it's tried and true that every account or most of your accounts are going to need a VPC. So having that be its own reusable piece unit is
Yeah.
an important thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like making your modules generally try to only operate on one region at a time, or basically using one provider configuration block at a time. We talked about this briefly last week, I think, and there is an exception to this, having like if your module is managing like a primary and delegated relationship, like you want to connect two pieces, then it's okay for a Terraform module to have multiple providers, but otherwise try and keep it to one so that it's very modular, very much like a stackable block. The other thing there's actually a negative to modules, also worth expressing. Introducing modules is great from a reusability perspective, but it really sucks when you just want to make a small change and it cascades through like 5 modules and you gotta first update the top level most module and then the downstream modules, bumping the version, and that development workflow gets pretty tedious in the beginning until you've established what it is you're trying to do. So creating a lot of modules up front might actually slow you down initially until you know what that architecture looks like.
Yeah, I want to add something actually. The question is whether you need to write the module itself or not, right? So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Cloud Posse has like 100 plus module. So I think nowadays any module you think of is already written and is already on the registry. You don't need to waste time. You don't need to invest time and effort unless you have a specific needs like a specific kind of modules like the Datadog that you mentioned. But from my previous experience working with Terraform, spent a lot of time writing modules which is already there.
Yeah.
So use a battle tested one like Cloud Posse or Terraform modules one on GitHub. These are tested. These are well used. You don't need to waste time. I think that's the question. Actually, if you need to write something, I'm very sure it's already there, right?
It is, and it gives you also this ability to think about things in a different way maybe sometimes. I feel like when we're just thinking about building some module and we're for my organization, my company, I'm not talking about Cloud Posse, like I'm an engineer at some company and I'm tasked with implementing something, I create this module. What often ends up happening is that module is so specific to that one use case or requirement that it becomes not reusable. But what we do at Cloud Posse when we design our modules, we're designing it without knowing those requirements. So it's general purpose. And then the root modules, that's where you make it proprietary. That's where you make it solve your specific use case by putting together generic multi-purpose modules. I also want to emphasize, like, once you have a lot of these modules, I get it might be a little bit different for an organization, and you don't always need to stay on the bleeding edge, and you don't always need to update everything. But we invest like this month. We've already invested over $25,000 this month on our open source modules out of our own pockets. So that's a lot for smaller companies to invest in managing their modules and stuff like that. And what you get working with an ecosystem like Cloud Posse is that overhead is taken away from you.